back here today with my friend and distinguished colleague, Professor Natalie van Deusen, currently at the University of Alberta, formerly at the University of Wisconsin, where she was my Doktorschwester, if that's a thing. Do people say that?
I don't know. Probably. Why not? We'll say it now.
People say Doktormutter, Doktorvater. Like
exactly.
Yeah, so we got our PhDs from the same advisor at around the same time. So you said you would like to talk a little bit about Rímur and post-medieval transmission of sagas. So why don't you start off by just telling us what are Rímur?
So Rímur, it's basically its equivalent to the word like rhymes. And these are basically long narrative poems, and they were composed towards the end of the Middle Ages in Iceland, right around the time that saga writing was sort of dwindling, annalistic writing was sort of coming to an end. The Reformation was coming shortly thereafter. A lot of literature was being converted basically from prose into poetry, and in an early form, probably a kind of poetry that accompanied dancing. And this became a hugely popular genre in the post-medieval era, and began with some Rímur on St. Olavur in the Battle of Stiklestad, but they quickly exploded, and a lot of different sagas, both secular and religious, were converted to this form and transmitted in this way.
So it's a medium that achieves a certain amount of like fast growing popularity. And as you said, a lot of stuff gets converted into it. Could you think of it a little bit like how in the 20th and 21st centuries, there's been a rush to convert older literature into movies?
Yeah, I would think so, for sure. It seems to have a more they were used for, during, as if they accompanied dances, there was some entertainment function to them. It was a versification of these longer sagas, and it flourished for about 500 years, actually. So it started in the 14th century and went well into the 19th century. And there are still people who recite Rímur today. And I know Sigur Rós in Iceland have collaborated with some contemporary Rímur poets, and a lot of a variety of different texts had been converted in this way. And I think that's a really apt comparison between sagas, Rímur, and novels, movies. It's sort of a popularized form.
And in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, is more of what's preserved in Rímur original to Rímur, or is more of it reworked material from earlier periods?
A lot of it is reworked. It's kind of a split. A lot of it's reworked material from earlier periods. And it's very, I think you could absolutely say it's very similar to, troubadour traditions, though it doesn't seem that there's the same kind of idea of traveling poets, although there were certain poets or Rímur composers who were quite well known to, and famous for kind of converting these saga narratives into Rímur. The king sagas seem to have been really popular. But by far, what's really interesting, I think, is that the church saw how popular this kind of literature was in this form of poetry. And so they kind of seized on it, and a lot of the Rímur that were composed ended up being religious in nature, because the church saw how popular this was, and they, in an effort to sort of kind of meet the public halfway, as Margaret Eggertsdottir, who's done a lot of work on this, has said, they said, well, we can't beat them, so we're going to just use this method. And a lot of religious texts were converted into Rímur as a way to sort of use this medium that was really popular. So that kind of took over pretty quickly as one of what is kind of the most voluminous kind of verse that we have in Rímur form.
Well, you know that I'm obsessed with making stupid analogies. So this reminds me of Christian rock.
Absolutely.
Rock music is here to stay. So we're going to.
Absolutely. We may as well use it. Exactly. So hagiographic content. Exactly. And that's exactly what my own specialization is. So what happened was, so the advisor that Dr. Crawford mentioned, Kirsten Wolf, she and I were working on a book together on the saints in Old Norse and early modern Icelandic poetry, because I specialize in the saints as well. I hadn't really done much with poetry, but she sort of said, she had done a saints in Old Norse prose book, and she wanted to do a poetic companion to that. And so I said, sure. She said, well, we're going to split the work this way. I'll take all the skaldic poetry, you take everything else, which initially sounded really great to me, until I realized how much material there was and how much has been undocumented, basically. So there's all of these post-medieval manuscripts, and it's just like an explosion of popularity of religious verse, of hagiographic content, which I find really interesting because the Reformation came to Iceland in 1550, but these poems about saints were sung, and so Rímur were sung, absolutely. So the Rímur, and then some of the later verse that was based on the Rímur and kind of condensed into what are called kvæði, or poems, or other visur. They were sung, and they often are said that they're sung to a certain meter, or whatever log. They became hugely popular. In some cases, there are poems, Rímur, and then later on poetry on saints that exist in like hundreds of manuscripts. And these are poems composed like in the 1700s in Iceland. So it became really successful from the perspective of the church by kind of co-opting this form of poetry. So kind of accidentally, I ended up working on poetry. It was not like, I started in my PhD, I was working on prose narratives and saint sagas from the 14th century. And it turned out that this was like it was just, there's this great, like this massive like wealth of literature that people don't like to touch because it's post-medieval, but it's pre-modern, and the handwriting isn't very easy to read. There's a lot of it. It's not well cataloged. And I felt like I just like opened Pandora's box by like starting. So what at first I thought was going to be maybe a pretty easy assignment, like, yay, I don't have to do skaldic poetry, ended up to be like, give me like, I think a career's worth of work now to continue on with. So it's exciting. And I'm dealing a lot with right now with like why some of this was really popular.
And it's yeah, when you say, I mean, you think originally that there's some relief, I don't have to do skaldic poetry. At least someone has gathered the skaldic poetry for you.
Exactly. And what will happen is a lot of these post-medieval manuscripts, like the manuscript catalogs, the medieval ones, they'll tell you, like they'll itemize the content of the manuscripts, and they'll say that these manuscripts contain this saga, this poem, whatever. But the post-medieval manuscripts, they don't. There's so many of them, and there was such a high rate of literacy in Iceland. They were very poor, but there was a very high rate of literacy, and so there's just a huge amount of manuscripts, also in North America and Canada and the States, that contain this type of poetry, and there's just so much. So actually St. Ursula, I specialize in women's saints, so I can speak best to them, but I know St. Ursula and her companions, they get looking at, not necessarily in Rímur tradition, but in some of the shorter poetry that ends up, that's a little bit, they can be in some Rímur meter. So there's Rímur, which are really quite long narrative epic poems. And then these kind of evolved later on into shorter verses of maybe like 26 stanzas or something like that. And actually, there is a website, and I can put it in the chat here. I'm going to actually look up, you can hear some people actually reciting these, like from their folklore collectors who went around the country. And sorry, I'm just going to look it up really quick while I'm chatting here. There are some folklore collectors who went around the country and basically listened to people reciting these verses. So these survived pretty well into the 20th century. But Ursula and her companions was one. So like there were men and women who were still composing these. They usually were quite elderly, like well into the into the 20th century. Here, I'll put this in the chat here. Yeah, Ismus, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's the one. So and I've worked at Bragi as well. So they do all of the various meters.
And so it seems, correct me if I'm getting the wrong impression here, but that these stories about saints are lasting surprisingly long into the Lutheran period, because Lutheranism can be pretty hostile to that stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, they certainly made some modifications. So they took away some of like the miracles and stuff. But I just finished up a book on Saint Agnes of Rome, whose poems, like she's the one I put an example of here that you can actually hear how it was sung. It was a poem that was actually based on a Rímur in 4 fits. So there's 4 basically like chapters. They're like chapters of the Rímur. So fits or rima, because Rímur is plural and the singular is rima. So there's 4. Usually Rímur has Rímur have like multiple rima that make them up, and they're kind of like chapters. So there was an Agnesar Rímur that was in 4 fits, and this poem seems to have been, and I can put it in the chat as well because it's on the Bragi the site that was mentioned in the chat here as well. So this is one I'm writing about because I found out that it's a virgin martyr. So she was an early Roman saint, 4th century, young girl, virgin martyr legend. So she was a Christian and a pagan lord wanted to marry her. And she said, no, I'm married to Jesus. And then they torture her and she dies in defense of her virginity in really brutal tortures. So she was like stripped naked and led to a brothel through the streets. I think about like Cersei and, in Game of Thrones, like, when she's led through the streets and they're saying shame, shame. And then they try to light her on fire and they do all this stuff. So it's a pretty brutal legend, and it existed in like over 100 manuscripts, as well as these audio recordings. And these are just the manuscripts that survived. And so we know that this one was extremely popular. And that's what I'm trying to I'm trying to figure out. I think there's a variety of reasons for it. But the virgin martyrs like Agnes and Ursula and Dorothy and Barbara, they seem to have been especially popular for whatever reason among these later poets.
I'm almost sure, maybe I'm going crazy, I'm almost sure that I've read a prose Agnesar saga or Thalfrid.
Yep. So it seems the Rímur probably were based on, it's unclear, but it seems to have been based, at least, if not on the Old Norse, at least on the Latin on which the Old Norse was based, because it was composed at it was composed in the 1600s by a priest who would have had access to some materials. And it's interesting because he dedicates, oftentimes the Rímur are dedicated to someone. So in the Rímur, he dedicates it to the daughter of his friend. And he dedicates this poem that he's composed about this virgin martyr saint to this young girl, Hólmfríður Benediktsdóttir, who he says, I hope that you'll be a good girl and all of this stuff. So it seems like she's quite young. So he's versifying this really pretty brutal legend about a virgin martyr saint for a young girl. And so I think a lot of stuff with gender and purity and stuff and kind of post-medieval Reformation Iceland is tied up in there.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I'm just gonna look here. So make sure I didn't, there's some continuity with some skaldic poetry to Rímur. I don't know skaldic poetry too well. They do have some similar features in terms of alliteration and their own use of kennings as well. They love to use kennings in Rímur. I don't think they use the extended kennings in the same way. And there's a whole there's a whole bunch of different Rímur meters. So if you look at that site, the first one that Stella put in the chat here, bragi.artmastopnin.is, that one, it has a whole bunch of different meters that you can find as well. But Brigit, she never actually had a legend. Bridget of Ireland, or Bridget of Sweden. Neither of them ended up having a legend that we know of in Iceland, either in the medieval or post-medieval period.
Huh. Kind of surprising, especially for the Swedish one.
I know, exactly. Yeah, that just never, I think it was just so late in their later kennings, and that you don't necessarily see in skaldic poetry. Yes. Oh, there's some really interesting rune stuff too. And they'll do some weird things with runes. They'll do kennings for runes in order to hide their names, and these kind of these runic kennings, so they'll kind of conceal their names within a verse by referring to runes, and then it kind of mixes up their name and all of that. So there's some really interesting. An example, yes. So let me see if I can find one really quick. I did one. I wrote an article about one, and I'm going to just grab the book here, because I did an edition of a poem that is not a Rímur, but it's kind of within the same sort of tradition, and it was called Kvennarima. Oh, it was a Rímur. Never mind. My memory is not great clearly about the things I wrote myself. Kvennarima. It was so it's the rima about women, and basically it was a bunch of cautionary tales for women. It was the poet set out to compose at least one rima, maybe more. We only have it in a fragment, by detailing all the worst women in history, starting with the Bible and then going through like the sagas. So he begins with, of course, seems to begin with Eve, but it's not sure because it's a fragment, and then goes on to Delilah and the wife of Potiphar, and then there's another lacuna in the manuscript, and then there are some examples from the sagas as well, a lot from chivalric sagas and things like that. So the author conceals his name in the last, second to last stanza, and I'm going to try to find it here, where he does this, because it was kind of like a little puzzle, and it's really I'm going to try to find where it was. So, but maybe I'm thinking of the wrong one now, that I should have been a little bit better prepared for this particular example. But
this is when you said conceal, runes and kennings and concealing their names, I thought, well, an illustration of that. Yeah. I'm not sure I exactly follow what you're saying.
So let me just see if I can, I'm going to see if I can find, it's similar to Galdra book. I'm going to see if I can find, if I have one that I can pull up here while we're chatting, because I did, maybe it was the one about good women, because maybe I'm getting them mixed up, because there was one about good women and one about bad women. So it's, and I think maybe it was actually the one about good women that I did for Kirsten's Festschrift. So clearly I have too many things on the go at the moment. So I'll pull that one up. And
so good women and bad women, we've got.
There's one about, and they're different poems. So and I kind of argue about how they make their own, it's kind of like their own genre. And it kind of is this within the context of like Mirror for Women works and things like that. So it's called Maul Runar. And I'll put that in the chat. And you're just going to have to look at I don't know, this will probably, I don't know how this is going to come out in the, here. What I'll do is I will just, I will take this, so I will put this in a different document, so I'm not like sharing something that hasn't been published yet, and I'll show you what it looks like. So this is really common in post-medieval verse. So the poem's penultimate, can you see this here?
Yep.
The poem, this is a poem called Kvendaimethautur, and it's from the 18th century. And the poem's second to last stanza, he gives his name using Maulrunar, speech runes, in which kennings are used to refer to runic signatures, which in turn spells the poet's name. So Suna og Unar solid Thiel, so sun, that's a kenning, it means the sun, and then a kenning for ice as well. So S, I, and then K, which is a pierced K is a G, period of rains is Ur, U, travel, rave, R, tier, T or D, a pierced tier, D, and then U, R for Ur, and then rave. So Sigurður. So this is a really fascinating and common way in which poets like to cleverly conceal their names within poetry in post-medieval verse. And they do it by kennings that refer to runic signatures, which in turn spell the poets' names. And it can be like in this one, in this correct order. Sometimes they do it all mixed up though, in addition to that. So
That's cool. No, I see what you're saying now.
yeah.
That's a fun way of, yeah. And it's very playful in the way that kennings and such often are.
Exactly. So I can probably find the text for it, or the manuscript for it, if you would like to see it. It's LBS. This is one of them that I got them to digitize when I was working on this. So yeah, no, it's really interesting. So they play a lot with some of these, characteristics of medieval verse, and they depend quite a bit. They're quite dependent upon, kennings and runes and things like that. So, and they have various other ways that they kind of almost speak in code. It's almost like and there's some really interesting examples of that in poetry as well.
So it must have been fairly widespread and a pretty understood thing, because otherwise people would say, what are you talking about?
Exactly.
What is this stuff about,
exactly.
the traveling and the board of the sea. And,
yeah, but there were also some manuscripts that were almost like decoders. So you think about those, like, I'll use an analogy for you. So like when, because I know you like those, I'm going to do them myself. So like those decoder rings that you would get like in cereal boxes or something like that would help you crack a code. They have those, like, but sometimes there's a problem because like we have the manuscript and there's a poem that's using one of these codes, but we don't have the key for it.
Oh, no.
And so some of those are really difficult to figure out, if not impossible. So I'm working on one of those with a poem about Agnes. That's not a rima, or it's not Rímur. It's instead of it's Agnesar Visur. And yeah, in this one, it's completely unclear what the poet is doing because there is no key. He uses like dots. He's like this many dots and this many dots, and he hides his name, but it can vary so much by manuscript and by poet. So it wasn't always very standardized.
Right.
And there's a number of these as well that you can kind of look at too. There's a number of manuscripts that have these codes in them, and I'm going to try to find a reference to one of these works that talk about this, because it's like it's one of these really fascinating. They wanted to make it almost as difficult as possible sometimes, I think. So yeah, anyway, I'll stop talking. Look at the did anyone ever guess? I don't know. This poem was only in one manuscript, and Sigurður, this guy who wrote this poem, is not a very well-known poet either. So I mean, like, it's totally unclear. We have so little information on the reception of this, of these poems. We know, who might have written them, and sometimes we know from how many copies there were that they were popular. This one was only in one manuscript, so we don't have much information about its popularity or its reception.
Well, and it's a common name, so trying to figure out exactly which Sigurður might be pretty.
Yep, it took me some time,
tough.
and I mean, I'm still not sure if I got the right Sigurður too. So it seems likely that it's the one that I Sigurður Daðason is the one I think I said it was. Yeah, so there's so Málrunar can be actual like kennings to use to runic signatures, but they can also be other kind of ciphers as well, and something that's called Vitluletur. So Alessia Bauer wrote an article about this, and I'm going to put it in the chat here if you're interested in learning more. It's in German, and it's about runic manuscripts and various kind of ciphers that poets and other, not just poets, but also other post-medieval authors use to kind of try to be clever and conceal their names in these manuscripts. So if you don't have the code to the cipher, you can be in trouble.
You just assume by default that it says drink or Ovaltine.
Exactly.
And I see Marcel has.
Oh yeah, that's a really, really common. Absolutely. So, and yeah, you would have to be, so it could absolutely be like a test of some kind. So I was dealing with one poem that clearly does this. It's saying like, there are 3 points and then there's 1 point, and I had no idea what's happening. So I had to look at various kinds of like, or basically Morse code alphabets to try to figure out what it might be.
Well, and Estelle says, there's sometimes an extra kick in never having someone figure out you snuck something in.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've all done it.
Oh, absolutely. Exactly.
And,
so yeah, so that's an interesting feature that comes up in some of these post-medieval verses too. Like, they're technically, there's a named author to these Rímur, but sometimes we don't know who that is because they've concealed their names really cleverly within, like, whether it's Rímur or the later Kvæði or whatever, which are kind of just shorter versions. Rímur tend to be quite long, whereas Kvæði are very short.
Are there Rímur traditions in Scandinavia outside of Iceland? It seems similar to some stuff I've seen from the Faroes.
Yeah, I think the Faroes have some comparable. I think the Faroes have comparable traditions, and it's not unlike ballad traditions. So it's pretty closely related, and especially it was within like the beginning of the time that Rímur were composed. So they were really closely related to ballads, and especially since they had that accompaniment of dancing with them. So I think that the Faroe Islands also had something similar. I can't remember if they call them Rímur exactly. I don't know if they do, but they have similar traditions. Þáttur, it would be, I guess, so Þáttur would be, so like tale. Actually the poem that I showed you was called Kven Dæma Þáttur, which means like the tale of model women. Or sorry, I did the modern Icelandic because I'm dealing in a post-medieval period. So I often use the U before the R. So they could be somewhat similar in that they're shorter. But similar to ballad traditions, and there were like the scenes became popular in some ballads in like Norway, and there are definitely some like saint ballads of like Mary Magdalene at the well and things like that.
One thing that I'm curious to talk about a little bit is, are there medieval stories, sagas, or saints' lives or anything like that we don't have preserved written material on from the Middle Ages, but that can be postulated for the Middle Ages because there's Rímur that reworked that earlier material?
Like I'm trying to think about the Rímur I've worked with, and in some cases, like it's clear from these that like we get a sense about what like Latin sources. So I can speak most authoritatively to like the religious material, and it actually gives us a sense of what Latin material might have been available in Iceland prior to the Reformation, when a lot of that stuff got destroyed. So it gives us, I think, a sense, like with the Rímur on Agnes, for example. Like I can tell that there's more information than what we have like in just the medieval translated saga into Old Norse. So it's clear that there was other stuff in circulation that this kind of gives us a hint about. So with the religious material, it kind of, because so much Latin literature was lost in medieval Iceland with the Reformation. So that's been a really fascinating thing for me to see. I don't know if there's what's secular. I hesitate to use those differentiations because I don't think people thought about secular versus religious in the same way as we do now. But I'm not sure about like I can't think of any sagas necessarily that are like of like the sagas of Icelanders that exist in Rímur form, but not in prose.
And there are some Rímur that use fornaldarsögur material.
Right? Those were really, really popular. Yeah, those seem to be especially popular. The Riddarasögur and the Fornaldarsögur, those seem to have been especially popular for being made into Rímur. Kind of this is like the fantasy literature of the Middle Ages, and it continued to be that for. I think that's what Johanna Katrín Friedrichsdóttir talks about it as like the fantasy literature of the Middle Ages, like there, and it kind of is, and I think it continued in that way of within poetic tradition as well.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually it kind of related to what I had asked or like kind of in a similar vein. I think some Rímur about Hrolf Kraki may even actually precede the earliest manuscripts of the saga.
Okay, yeah, that's entirely possible. I don't know a lot about that since I focus so much of my attention on the religious material, but there are a lot of Rímur of Rolf Kraki, and it could very well be that that's the case.
Yeah, because that gets written down pretty late. I think the prose is like 1600s.
Okay, well, you would know.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, when you read it, like you can tell, like just read a chapter of Rolf Kraka, and it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of getting to be modern Icelandic. But anyway, looks like Cameron, Marcel, and Hannes all have questions down here.
So the contributing the rate of literacy, and that's something maybe you can help me on as well, Dr. Crawford, is the high rate of literacy. But I don't know. I mean, that's something that scholars have, I think, debated quite a bit about. I think that even from very like the kind of the oral culture of Iceland was quite unique, even from the Middle Ages. And kind of it was an unparalleled tradition that resulted in all of these sagas being composed and passed down orally and eventually written down. I think there's a lot of different, I think that oral tradition became like, it remained really, really important well beyond the Middle Ages. And I'm not sure about the high rate of literacy, but you have like farmers and stuff like that, like so it's not just like the clergy, it's also like, farmers who are learning to write and writing down. And I don't know if maybe the long winter nights have something to do with that, and needing to find something to do. A lot of the poets, talk about these long winter nights, and this is a way of passing the time and keeping people entertained during this time. I don't know. Do you know, Jackson?
Oh, I don't think that one can know, but I think, my impression is kind of that in general, Iceland is traditionally a very literary society, and very self-consciously so. And that for the last 8 centuries or something, that's included written literature. So I would say that it's actually it must be tied up somewhat with this very self-conscious literary tradition, and the fact that, of course, at a certain point you can't retain all of that by memory, and especially with the church giving extra status to writing, you want to put more of this down on vellum, and not just have it in your head. Yeah, I don't know. I think that is something like some part of the answer is that pride, that self-conscious.
I think so. Yeah, because I mean, and I don't know, I mean, how when it came under Norwegian rule quite early, and okay, that will be an interesting article to check out. Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of different things come together. But I think you're right. There's a lot of sort of like national identity tied up in the stories that they told. And a lot of these sagas are about basically the stories about ancestors. And so that becomes the beginning of it. So
yeah, and even some of those later, well, not necessarily later, but even some things where you wouldn't necessarily see that much Icelandic identity in them, there are still weird ways in which you can read some Icelandic identity into them, like some of the Hrafnista sagas. I mean, they're still that they don't ever go to Iceland, but these guys are supposedly like ancestors of some of the settlers of Iceland. There's still some family connection to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that could absolutely be that there was some propaganda, and that's something that especially with the religious material, like there's clearly a message that they're trying to get across, I think, in a lot of these, and like a moral of the story that's trying to be conveyed, and like they're seeing this as a useful medium for conveying a particular moral or idea. So I think with like the virgin martyr poetry, I don't think it's a coincidence that the majority of the manuscripts we do have information that we actually do have information about who owned them. Those that we do have, a lot of those, they were owned by women, and we have a lot of like this poem was copied for so and so, and it's usually a woman. And I think that there's there's meant to be a sort of an educational aspect to it, and it's meant to convey a message of some kind or another. And I think the religious material, I think we can kind of account for its popularity in that way. There seemed to have been like a particular message they wanted to get across, and seemed to have been especially meant for young women.
Makes sense.
And the Roman Catholic clergy. So have they left behind any record about their problems to comply? So I'm not as familiar with like I think that would be like in the charters and the annals, like the Icelandic annals, which would have a lot of the letters that would have been written to Icelandic bishops from like the archbishops in Nidaros, and even from beyond that. And you can get a sense. I don't know enough about those to be able to say, but I mean, there were things like, we know that the last Catholic bishop of Iceland was beheaded along with his two sons. And so like, we know that like there were like so we know that there were a number of priests and clergy who, despite, the idea that they were meant to be celibate, they didn't comply with those, with that. So I'd have to, I think that some of the answers might be in the annals that contain a lot of these, reminders that you have to be, adhering to this, such and such rite, or rules of the church. But I can't think of much, beyond the celibacy one off the top of my head.
And I don't think you would see much of that in sagas, right? This is...
No, I don't think so. And I know that we know that it was difficult for in the monastic communities for them to take on vows of that they, would have to completely dedicate themselves to contemplation or something like that. We knew that by necessity, they had to work, they had to milk the cows, they had to do all these things in order to survive. So the character of the dances, I think that there are. Vestin Olason, let me see if he has written a book called The Traditional Ballads of Iceland. I'm going to see if I can find a link. And he has quite a bit of information in there on that. He's kind of written the most on this. And it's based on this is just the Google book, gives you the cover, so at least you can see what it is. So that one tells about some of the particulars of for the dancing, and some of the different dances that are associated with the Rímur, and which in the earlier period, he talks quite a bit about that. So if you're interested in the traditional ballads and in early Rímur, I highly recommend looking at that. If you read Icelandic, he also has I'm just looking at it, it's on my shelf, it's called Sagna Dansar. It's the same author, and he, I think it's basically the same content, just before it was translated to English. So he's done quite a bit, and he works a lot with the different meters as well, as some of the dance practices. And some of this continued into some people still continued the practice.
Really? So are there organizations that consciously maintain and continue this tradition in Iceland?
I don't know if there are in Iceland as much as there. There are people that still sing Rímur and compose Rímur poetry. I don't know about the dances as much. I think the dances, it's a lot. It's much bigger in the Faroe Islands. They still have the ballad. It's not Rímur, but it's the ballads that they compose. They still have that as part of their tradition, their ring dances. So there are a lot of different sort of dances that were associated with these, so chain dances and things like that as well. I don't know a lot about the dances themselves.
Yeah,
it seemed to have been for. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, and there's that connection to the Faroe Islands again.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about this after that question was asked, where so many of their rhyming ballad-like poems have a title. I think in Faroese it's pronounced Totter, right? Thautor.
I know how it's spelled. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Yeah, Faroese. I'm always kind of hesitant to suggest how it's pronounced. And then, their equivalent of kvaidi, which I think in Faroese is kveya. Right.
Okay. But spelled the same because they have it. It's spelled
right.
the same.
Spelled the same. Yeah. That's why Faroese is hard. So I think there's some kind of connection even fairly late, just in the fact that these same words are being used in those titles. It sounds like the dancing accompanying the singing maybe had something to do with each other too.
Yeah, exactly. And it seemed to have been for entertainment. So I don't think there was any real ritualistic element to the dancing. They were, there's a lot of references that you can see that this, people would gather and they would sing these songs and dance, much like how, and I think the Faroe Islands and some of their current practices that have preserved this tradition give us some hints as to how, what was likely a parallel tradition in Iceland at the time.
And so when we were talking about the topic we were going to look at today, we had said Rímur and post-medieval transmission of sagas. Clearly, Rímur are part of the post-medieval transmission of sagas. Are there other important ways in which sagas were transmitted in the late medieval to modern periods?
Sure. I mean, the sagas were absolutely, so some of them were adapted to Rímur, but not all of them. And I mean, some of them were adapted to Rímur and they continued to be transmitted in their saga form. So I think Njál's saga is probably one of the best examples of a saga that was, transmitted in a wide variety of post-medieval manuscripts. But a lot of the sagas that we have, if you go to the website handwrit.is, and I think you can, that means handwrit means manuscript. If you look up under browse and you go to either uniform or supplied titles and you look up any saga, you can see basically all the manuscripts that preserve that saga. And you'll see that the vast majority of them are post-medieval. So a lot of times these are not used in editions because there has been, up until quite recently, within philology and the process of making editions, this focus on trying to find the best manuscript. And that usually means one of the oldest or most original, the one that's closest to the original. And so a lot of these manuscripts have tended to be overlooked. But now there's sort of a turn to what can, the fact that people were still copying this saga by hand in mass, and what can this tell us about the importance of this particular saga, for Icelanders living in, the 17th, 18th centuries, or there's oftentimes marginal entries and interesting commentaries and changes within the sagas on certain scenes. So they've recently gotten more attention than they used to, but there are still a lot that have gone, there's just so many copies of these texts that it's almost, I feel like it's sort of like the Wild West of Icelandic manuscript studies is the post-medieval, because it's so unexplored and it's uncatalogued, and it's really exciting, but also a little bit overwhelming how much there are. And the Njál Saga project, they did a huge research project at the University of Iceland on the transmission of Njál Saga, beyond the medieval period. So that's a great example of one. I don't know if we can find the project website, but they did the manuscript tradition of Njál Saga. That's a one that I think, but it was not just the sagas of Icelanders. It was a lot of these more fantastical sagas that became really popular in the post-medieval era. People seem to like the escapism of those, I think, a little bit. A lot of these ones that were the Fornaldarsögur, and that of telling about people, these fantastical people. Yes, that's, I think, their site as well. People that lived long ago and far away. So this is maybe one of the early ones. I'm not sure. They might have. It should be on the University of Iceland website, but in any case, there's some, so many of these sagas just continued to be transmitted, and by far, yes, that's exactly it, Stella. Thank you. That's the site for the transmission of Njál's saga on the and then the variants of Njál's saga. So it's just one example of how you see that sagas continued to be copied by hand well into even the 20th century. And that this remained, it was not only the sagas of Icelanders, but more kind of the fantastical literature as well. But it was considered, these were really well read. We can tell from this how important they were to people's like national identity, and everybody knew these sagas because they were transmitted by hand well into, and well beyond the printing press too. So there was a printing press in Iceland, but like people were still copying things by hand for centuries.
Well, and you're probably right that there's, beyond just not catalog, there's probably some of these early modern and even fairly late modern manuscripts that are just in somebody's trunk somewhere.
This happens all the time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is happening quite a bit in North America too. So like a lot of these post-medieval manuscripts, it'll just be like the national, and they're not housed in the same place as the medieval ones. They're given to national libraries. Sometimes they're given to district archives. And all it will say is like received from so-and-so in like 1950 or something. And it was in somebody's trunk. And there's very little information about where this came from, what it was copied from. And this is the case with a lot of the manuscripts in North America. I'll often even talking to people from, say, like the Icelandic community, because a lot of Icelanders who emigrated to Canada. And I'll talk to people and they'll be like, oh yeah, we have this handwritten thing sitting around, and it just will be like, okay, and you just add that one to the pile because, and it's really difficult because it's a lot of this hasn't even been put into the archives yet.
Well, and let's not underrate how hard the handwriting is to read.
Absolutely.
So, even if Icelandic, that early modern into early 19th century handwriting style they used is a nightmare if you haven't really specifically studied it.
It really can be. And it takes some time. It's not nearly as like, it makes like Gothic and everything just look like a dream. And sometimes it can be pretty clear, but it really depends on the scribe. And it can be really difficult to kind of figure out what they're even writing sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a big reason why not only are a lot of these manuscripts not identified, because people are like, I don't know what this says, and I guess I don't care. But then, even scholars, like, there's easier stuff out there to read.
Exactly.
Why don't I just stay in the Middle Ages?
Absolutely. No, there have been plenty of times as I've been working on the Agnes thing where I'm like, I'm going back to the medieval stuff after this, but I'm probably not going to, because I actually find this really fascinating. This idea of like this medieval content that's preserved well beyond the Middle Ages. And
and it's such a cool cultural question in a way too. Like, what's going on here? That's what keeps this so relevant, especially with the very Catholic. Content.
Well, and I like how they clearly show, like, so I had the one, and it's in this Icelandic Floralegium for Festskrift for Ulvar Bragason, which is through the Icelandica series, which I think is available for free online. I'm not totally sure, but that's where I did the edition of Kvenna Rima. And so that one is the one about the bad women. The other one I showed you is Kvendæma Þáttr, which is the tale of model women. I'm just putting the link to it's one manuscript in the chat. But what's so interesting about these poems is like, they list off like either model women or like bad women, good women or bad women from the sagas. So they show all of this, like, 18th century knowledge of these medieval texts. And they're saying like, if they're bad, like Gudrun Ósvífursdóttir, or depending if they're taking from later in her life, you're good, like Gudrun Ósvífursdóttir. Or, they Hallgerd is given as from Njál's saga. Hallgerd is given as a example of a bad woman whose model you should not follow. Whereas, they'll give examples of like Unna deep-minded or something, or Oyvind or whatever, depending on what you call her. So it shows this really interesting like engagement with saga literature, and like it gives us hint that like people would have known these references when they just kind of mentioned like, how like what a good model this particular saga woman was, whereas, what a bad, like Gunhildr Konungamodir is given as an example from the sagas of this one about cautionary tales for women as a bad woman, and Hallgerður Langbrok and Gudrun Osvífursdóttir are all given as examples of women who behave badly. So like it shows, and they're just kind of mentioned offhand, like that shows that, there was kind of general knowledge about these stories. And
Right.
I think that's really interesting too.
Yeah, there's an expectation that the audience knows who's being talked about, that you don't have to explain it.
Exactly. And
There's
also some really obscure ones too, some really obscure literature as well, which is kind of interesting that we don't otherwise have much evidence for, like German chapbooks and things like that, translated German and Danish chapbooks. So some of that tells us that there was, I think, a lot more circulating in translation than we realize.
Interesting. But then that stuff itself doesn't survive.
And yeah, exactly. So it doesn't survive. No, not a lot of it does. That was kind of a project. So actually, like the evil women from Rolf Saga Kraka was another one. They engaged with that one. The Riddar is so good and the Fortnald is so good. And it seems they very much within a Christian context. So they situate them kind of within this long kind of trajectory of this history of women from the Bible and from history, and then kind of put the sagas in there too. So they show that we either have good women to add to this, list of cautionary tales, or we also have bad women as well, whose examples should be followed. And this is kind of within so Christine de Pizan, Book of the City of Ladies and things like that was an early example. These question of women works where they would lay out examples of good and bad women for behavior as kind of exempla. So it seems to have been very much within a Christian context.
Interesting. I mean, there's just so much of this material there, and I've really appreciated you going over it with us, and also sharing, you and Stella sharing links where we can follow up on and look at some of this directly. Get a look at the primary sources ourselves.
Yeah, and if anybody is, who is listening is looking for a project, this is it really is like a gold mine. I feel like I just stumbled back. I fell backwards into this. I had no intention of working on poetry until Kirsten asked me to work on this project with her, and I realized that there was this wealth of material. And so it's not that I don't like poetry. It's just that it was never really been my thing. It's not, I didn't have the intention of looking at it. But when you realize what a fruitful medium this was for people to tell stories in the post-medieval period, and how much this accounted for, a lot of these stories that were previously just known within prose. Within the case of religious texts, they were mostly just known within the church. And they were, and kind of within the hands of priests and things. When you see this kind of popularized, it's really interesting.
And do you have any grad students at the University of Alberta working on this? Or?
I don't have any working on this specifically. So I supervise grad students in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion. But since I'm the only person that works in Scandinavian, I'm kind of limited in my ability to supervise on much more specialized topics like this. So I have graduate students that work more broadly on, comparative medieval topics and things like that. I would love to. I've been an opponent for a doctoral dissertation in post-medieval poetry, and I'm going to be giving a keynote, because once again, I feel like I completely accidentally became the person who all of a sudden specializes in this field that nobody was working on before. So I'm giving a keynote in Iceland in October. But again, I feel like it was all completely accidental, but yeah.
Is that a conference that was supposed to happen in 2020?
No, this one was not actually. The doctoral defense was supposed to have happened in 2020, and they were going to fly me out to Iceland and then put me up in the hotel but then it had to go by Zoom. So it's kind of, for various reasons, sad about that.
Yeah, so much stuff has been pushed since I'm about at the end of this month. I'm going to a conference that's still the 2020 Germanic Linguistics Conference.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm still working on stuff that was, from then. So playing a lot of catch up. Yeah.
Stella, I don't know if you saw the very appreciative comment there. Very thankful to get some time spent on this, which is of great personal interest, but it's not what people in the public necessarily ask about as much. So we don't always get to focus on this sort of thing on the YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Oh, that's a good question, Marcel, and I can absolutely answer that. Usually they did something bad in terms of seducing men. That tends to be the common thread here. Like a lot of it's been the cautionary tales for women. It's funny because the poet who wrote Kvennerima, which is the cautionary tales for women, the poem about bad women, supposedly was going to write a companion one about good women, but only lived long enough to write the first one. So that's all we have, and we only have it in a fragment. But almost all of them are how about they're doing something lustful, they're deceiving men in some way, usually sexually. And so that's why, like Gunhild, the mother of kings, is one who's mentioned. So usually they've led men astray in virtue or something like that. So they seduced a man or something like that. So usually it has to do with something like that. That's kind of and then for the good women as well, they were virtuous often in that way. They weren't promiscuous, or they behaved virtuously in oftentimes their virtue had to do with like their devotion to God or something like that. Or I think that I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty sure that like some of them it's, how they stood by their husband or something like that. So a lot of like things that would align with some good Protestant values as well, like in Martin Luther's like Table of Duties and the Lutheran Catechism and things. So a lot of that stuff really lines up with what was kind of set out as gendered expectations from the perspective of the Protestant church.
Yeah, and of course, like you said, occasionally there are women that can fit in different sides of that, depending on what point in their life you're looking at. Like
that's why I think Gudrun is so interesting. She's in this tale as a bad woman because of what she did with like basically orchestrating the murder of Kjartan. And then the other one, she's in the tale as a good woman, and that's because she became this like repentant like nun and anchoress at the end of her life and just dedicated herself to serving God. So it just, depending on which part of her story you take, she can fill either role.
Yeah, that Laxala Saga is it's a text you can read a lot out of, and people have been reading a lot out of for a long time.
For sure.
Well, we've really appreciated you taking the time. That's about an hour, which is very generous.
Well, I'm happy to do it.
Another question or two, if anyone has one, wants to throw one in. Okay, looks like maybe our curiosity is satiated for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for pointing us to those extra resources.
Absolutely. And if there's anything else I can help with on my academia.edu page, I often have been uploading some of these as I have the PDFs available. Okay, but I don't know how current it is. Otherwise, if the PDF isn't up there, then at least you'll have the reference to hopefully be able to find it.
Very cool. And are there going to be proceedings, you think, from the conference later this year?
The Iceland one?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not totally sure yet. But it is going to be about post-medieval and kind of like the religious verse and the popularization of religious verse. So, but I'll let you know if there are.
Okay, sounds interesting.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right. Well, thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
For your time.
All right.
Wish everybody all the best.
Okay. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.